Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review video where I talk about several albums released earlier this year that for one reason or another I didn't have a chance to review in full when they initially came out, so instead I'm covering them here today in this video. So yeah, you guys know the drill by this point, so let's get started with the first album I want to talk about today, the newest album from Girls' Rituals, Craps. Girls' Rituals is the music project of Debbie McCallion, one of the members of the now defunct band Black Dresses, and I discovered Black Dresses earlier this year with the release of their last album, Peaceful as Hell, which is, as of right now, one of my favorite records of the year. It's a fantastic project, you should certainly give it a listen. But yeah, when this album came out, I was interested in checking it out just because I loved that one album so much, and after listening to this new album here, it's a pretty great project. I'm happy I checked it out. Stylistically, this project I think could best be described as this kind of noisy, quirky, electronic-influenced pop record, though I don't even think that description necessarily gives this record its due credit, just because there's a pretty unique sound and mix of ideas on display here with this record, to the point where I think just kind of slapping a genre label on it doesn't really do it justice. Pretty much all of the instrumentals here on this project have a pretty heavy electronic influence to them, but there's still a good amount of variety on display here with the instrumentals, and most of them have a kind of noisy, glitchy sound to them that I really like too. Not noisy and glitchy in the sense that this record is super harsh or abrasive to listen to or anything quite like that, but I think it's just, noisy enough to add a bit of an anxious atmosphere to this record, which I think is rather appropriate given the vocal performances here on this project, and a lot of the lyrics on this project as well, though I'll touch upon those a bit later on. Some of my favorite moments on this project instrumentally include the closer track to This Thing Curse, which has this instrumental that isn't super noisy or abrasive necessarily. It's probably one of the more stripped back on this project as a whole, but I really love how it adds to the feel of this closing track. I think it adds this kind of final feel to it that I think a good album closer should really have, and it just fits the track really nicely. Another moment I really like is on the track Dream for Hope, which has this excellent thumping bass line in it that I really love. It just pops out to me every time I listen to this record, and I really love it every time too. When it comes to the vocal performances here on this project, they're pretty great too, mostly featuring some pretty nervous sounding performances that I think pair up really nicely with the instrumentals, as I mentioned before. A lot of the hooks on this thing I think are really memorable and really catchy too. And there's just a good amount of variety once again when it comes to a lot of the vocal deliveries here. While I said before a lot of the deliveries kind of have this anxious feel to them, that's not the case of course for the entire project. There are some moments that kind of step away from that a bit, where maybe the performances are a bit more reserved, like on the closing track that I mentioned earlier, or there are some moments where the performances maybe are a bit more frantic than the norm for this project. Probably one of the most unique moments on this project vocally comes on the track Elevator Out of the Catacombs, which for one thing uses the hook from the song Like a G6 by Far East Movement for its own hook. And while I'm not a fan of the original song, and I'm not a fan particularly of the hook on the original song, I think the reinterpretation of it here on this track is actually really great, mostly because Debbie just adds this very nervous, anxious delivery to it that fits in really nicely with the very harsh, kind of shrill instrumental that gets played along with the chorus here on this track. But in addition to that, there's also this spoken word kind of breakdown towards the middle of the track where Debbie's just kind of complaining about guys who have bad taste in music, and it fits the feel of this track really nicely when it comes to the anxiousness of it, the nervousness of it. It fits really nicely, and it's one of the standout moments on this album as a result of that. And when it comes to the lyrics across this project, I think they're pretty great as well. Again, they carry a lot of kind of anxiousness and nervousness in them that I think is really fitting, considering, again, the vocal performances on this thing and the instrumentals. But in addition to that, I think that the approach to tackling a lot of the topics in the lyrics here on this album is also very creative and interesting too. A lot of the approaches here aren't super typical, and it just makes a lot of the concepts for these songs more interesting than I think they would be if they were tackled by maybe a less ambitious artist. For example, you have tracks like Pixar, which is talking about being naive and, kind of falling victim to things like CGI as being like a metaphor for, I guess, being naive in real life. You have a track like I Just Want to Make the Whole Earth Smile, which is just this kind of heartbreaking track talking about wanting to, make people happy and, kind of the sadness that comes along with that. So overall, I really enjoyed this album. I think it's really creative. I think the instrumentals on this thing are really solid. I think the vocal performances here are really great too. Lots of memorable hooks, lots of great lyrics as well. I think this is just a pretty enjoyable project if you're into this kind of weird, indie, sort of alternative style of pop music. If you like that kind of stuff, I would certainly give this album a listen because I don't think you will regret it. There's lots to really enjoy here. But with that said, let's move on to the next album I want to talk about here today, the newest album from Ada Rook, 2020 Knives. While this is a different project than the one I was last talking about, it is somewhat related to it, given that Ada Rook is the other member of the now defunct band Black Dresses. And the reason I checked this album out was much of the same reasons I checked out the last album I was just talking about, because I really enjoyed that Black Dresses record, and I was expecting to really enjoy this too, and I did. I really loved this project as well. Much like the Girls' Rituals album I was just talking about, I think the general sound of this album here could best be described as being kind of noisy, indie alternative pop, but once again, I feel like that label is far too limiting when it comes to talking about this record, just because there's so much more packed into this project that I feel like that label is just way too restrictive here when speaking about this thing. One of my favorite things about this record as a whole is just Ada Rook's attention to detail when it comes to the intensity of her performances across this project, when it comes to the volume of the performances too, not in a literal sense of like the mixing and the volume. In that regard, all that's fine on the record. I'm talking more about the volume and the intensity of her performances themselves here on this thing. I think she has a really interesting approach to laying out these songs and structuring them so that you have a nice mix of different intensities across this project. You'll have moments on this record where a lot of the performances are a bit more stripped back, a bit more reserved. You'll have moments on this record where the performances are very intense and very aggressive. There'll be moments on this record of just silence. And I feel like all of these different moments on the project and everything that falls in between those things I just mentioned are all spaced out and used in really interesting ways to hold your attention throughout this project's runtime. A good amount of the tracks here on this record, I think, go for a somewhat more reserved approach to things. Their instrumentals here on this thing still have a kind of noisy, glitchy sound to them, but they're not super overbearing or abrasive or anything quite like that. Rook's vocal performances on these tracks are done, through clean singing, things like that. And I still think they managed to carry with them a good helping of nervousness, anxiety, and uncertainty too, which I think is pretty appropriate given a lot of the lyrics on this project, but again, I'll touch upon those in a bit. And when this album wants to deliver to you some really aggressive moments, it does a great job of doing so. While the aggressive moments on this thing don't take up the majority of the runtime, when they do hit on the album, they hit really hard. For example, you have the track 2020 Hands, the sister track to the title track on this thing, which has some of the most aggressive performances on this entire project. One of the noisiest and most cacophonous moments on the entire record, and it's one of the standouts for that reason, especially since there aren't that many super heavy moments that come before it in the track list. You also have the closing track to this thing, An Ocean, which has, yet again, some very aggressive performances to it, some very emotionally driven aggressive performances as well, I should say. It just leads to this track being a fantastic closer to this record. It just feels like this big emotional release at the end of the project that I just love every time I get to it. If you're going to talk about fantastic album closers that have come out this year, An Ocean needs to be in your discussion because it is such a fantastic way to end off this project. In addition to that, I really love the 14th track on this thing as well, just because I think it takes a lot of what I've mentioned already about this album as a whole and kind of compacts it into a single track. You have some of the more reserved performances here on this song, but you also have some more aggressive moments too. And the switch up between these moments on this song are fantastic as well. It just makes for one of my favorite moments on this project as a whole. If there's any song on this thing that I think just sounds and defines this record as a whole, just in a single song, I think it's this one. When it comes to the vocal performances here on this project, they're pretty great, whether it be the clean singing here on this project or some of the more aggressive shouted vocals across this project. I think Ada does a fantastic job with all of the performances here on this record. I also really like some of the usage of different vocal manipulations across this project as well. Just adds another layer of sound to this project that I think is used in a really creative way at certain points on this thing too. A lot of the hooks on this record are really fantastic too and really catchy as well, whether it's done with some more traditional clean singing or, for example, on the track 2020 Hands, whether it's done with some of the more aggressive shouting. I feel like the hooks across this album are still really memorable, and the lyrics on this project are really fantastic too, again tapping into lots of different anxieties and fears and uncertainties. I feel like a lot of the tracks on this thing, while they tackle different, subject matters, they all kind of tie together in a really cohesive way too. Lots of tracks here on this record seem to focus particularly on themes of uncertainty and wanting to be accepted, things along those lines, and they're all taken and expanded upon, of course, like I said before, in each of the individual tracks on this thing in very interesting and unique ways. Some of my favorite moments on this record when it comes to the lyrics include the 15th track, September, which is this song talking about a relationship that eventually goes sour and just becomes a bad thing. A lot of the lyrics here on this track just feel particularly personal, and the same could really be said for the track I Don't Want to Hurt You, the 11th track on this thing, which is yet again just another really personal, intimate moment on this project. When it comes to complaints that I have with this record, I honestly don't really have too many. I do think that the album could maybe be a little bit shorter and maybe a little bit more concise, though honestly that's not really because there are any tracks on this thing that are a bit weaker than the rest or anything quite like that. It's mostly just because I feel like the overall runtime of this record could just feel a little bit long when everything is put together. But again, if you were to ask me to pick a few tracks to cut from this thing, I would have to think a good long while about that, because this is a very consistent record when it comes to the quality of the individual songs here. So overall, I think this is a really great album. Again, I think the lyrics on this project are really great. I think the instrumentals across this project are really creative. I think the vocal performances here are fantastic too. I think the flow of this album is really great as well. What minor complaints I have with this thing really do not interfere with my overall enjoyment of this record, and it's certainly worth checking out if you're into this kind of music. Give this thing a listen for sure. Moving on though, the next record I want to talk about today is the newest record from Backxwash. God Has Nothing to Do with This, Leave Him Out of It. Now typically in these catch-up review segments that I do, there's not like an overarching concept or idea or any kind of link between the projects I'm talking about, but today's video apparently is an exception to that, because in addition to the first two records I already talked about and the connection between those two, which I already mentioned, I discovered this third album I'm talking about here today because both artists I've already talked about in this video already happen to feature on this album, and I'm happy I decided to give this thing a listen basically, because this is another fantastic record. This is just a really creative, really interesting, and really well-performed hip-hop project. One of my favorite hip-hop albums of the year so far, hands down. There's just so much to really enjoy in this project, which is especially saying a lot considering that this isn't a super long album or anything. It's about 20 minutes or so in length, but there's so much to still enjoy here on this record despite its short length. For one thing, I think the instrumentals here on this project are really great. The sound of this thing is very dark and moody. A lot of the synths that are used here reflect that sound really nicely. A lot of the percussion here on this record is really hard-hitting. There's some occasional guitar work here on this thing that also has this kind of dark, aggressive sound to it, very metal-inspired. In fact, there's even some sample work here on this thing that's taken directly from some heavy metal songs, probably the biggest example being the first track on the record, the title track, which has a sample of the Black Sabbath song, Black Sabbath, a song that I really love in its original form, but I think the sample of it here on this track is equally amazing, honestly, essentially taking some of Ozzy's vocals and some of the guitar work on the original track and kind of twisting it into this very dark, ominous sounding hook and instrumental here on this track. You also get a couple of instrumental interludes on this project, courtesy of Father Fake, as well as the artist Skin. I think both of these interludes are pretty interesting, and they just kind of help with the flow of this record overall. I think they're pretty neat. Overall, the instrumentals here on this record are just really cool in my opinion. I think they fit the whole kind of dark, aggressive horrorcore theming of this record really nicely. I think they're really creative, and while there's certainly other artists out there that have sounds that are maybe, kind of playing to a similar idea that this record is, I don't think any of them really have the exact same blend of sounds that this record here does. In addition to the really fantastic instrumentals on this project, Backxwash's delivery on all of these songs here is really fantastic as well. The rapping here on this record just pairs up so nicely with the instrumentals here on this thing when it comes to matching the very dark atmosphere that a lot of the instrumentals on this thing have. The lyrics on this record are really fantastic as well, in part because I think they managed to pair up really nicely, again, with the deliveries here on this thing, as well as the instrumentals, but also because there's just a lot of really interesting stuff being talked about in the lyrics of this record. On the Bandcamp page for the release of this thing, it says that this project is about forgiveness and things of that sort. I'm guessing it could be in a religious sense, given, of course, the title of the record, as well as a lot of the other lyrics and ideas brought up on some of these songs here. Though, given some of the other lyrics and moments on this thing, I'm also guessing it's also in a more personal sense as well. Throughout this release, Backxwash is essentially tackling the subject of forgiveness in her own unique way, while at the same time also bringing up other unique ideas and individual tracks on this thing as well. For example, the song Black Magic seems to be talking about bad habits and just kind of, falling victim to these bad habits, being addicted almost to these bad habits, and just having them negatively affect you. The song Into the Void, which I'm guessing is another Black Sabbath reference here on this thing, is a track where Backxwash is essentially talking about being in fear while in public, while out in the open, just being anxious constantly all the time, whether it be as a result of things like racism or transphobia, all of these things essentially weighing on her and just leading to this very dark, anxiety-filled track that is one of the most impactful moments on the entire project, in my opinion. When it comes to hooks on this record, some of the tracks on this thing aren't exactly shooting to have any kind of hooks on them whatsoever, but when it comes to the tracks that do have choruses to them, I think that they're really memorable, at times really catchy too, whether they be some of the ones performed by Backxwash herself, or some of the ones performed by featured artists, for example on the track Spells, where the hook is performed by Devi of Girls' Rituals, which I was talking about before. I think it's one of the catchiest hooks on this project, overall just a really great feature. So yeah, overall I think this record is a really great project. Again, one of my favorite hip-hop releases of 2020, as of now for sure. I think the production on this thing is really creative. I think the rapping here is really fantastic. The hooks on this thing are really memorable. And the lyrics here on this project are really fantastic as well. Overall, Backxwash certainly has a sound on this project that I think is unique and that I think is worth hearing if you're a hip-hop fan. Again, as I mentioned earlier when talking about the instrumentals on this thing, while there are certainly other artists out there that play to a similar lane that Backxwash is doing here on this project, I don't think any of the other artists out there that kind of play around with this sound have any tracks or projects out there that sound exactly like this one. And I think because of that, you should certainly give this thing a listen. I think it's an excellent project. If you're a hip-hop fan, again, as I've been saying multiple times already in this review, please check this project out. And with that said, this sums up today's catch-up review. Everything I've said so far in this video has just been my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree with any of my thoughts on these projects, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to drop your own thoughts on these albums in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like more album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Again, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.